On September 21, 1996, what began as an act not born of teenage rebellion, but of teenage self-care, ended in a senseless murder when 15-year-old Danielle Houchins asked her mother for permission to drive to Cameron Bridge fishing access site, seeking some time alone after a family argument. The teen left her home in Belgrade, Montana at around 11 a.m. and drove her pickup truck to the picturesque nature preserve located just a few miles south, an innocent place to wind down after an innocuous conflict at home. Danielle, who went by Danny to those closest to her, was familiar with the area and had visited Cameron Bridge previously. The site was commonly used by locals to access miles of wade fishing spots. In the early autumn breeze, those who visited the place regularly say that in the early autumn breeze, the cottonwood trees would have been molting, its billy tufts falling and fluttering like snow on the banks of the Gallatin River. When she didn't return home at the expected time, her mother grew concerned and elicited the help of a family friend in order to begin searching for the 15-year-old. Danielle's mother remembered that her daughter had been dressed in blue jeans and a gray sweatshirt. She'd also been wearing a knee brace on her left leg, remnants of an injury she had sustained while dancing with friends at a street festival just weeks prior. Once the two arrived at the preserve, they were alarmed to discover Danny's unlocked truck in the parking lot of the recreation area, her water bottle and car keys nearby. For 2 hours, they searched the area frantically for Danny, but finally at around 5 p.m. they contacted the Gallatin County Sheriff's Office and reported the 15-year-old missing. Local search and rescue along with citizen volunteers quickly arrived and continued looking for the teen, an effort which persisted until darkness fell. The lack of light made it increasingly dangerous to navigate the wooded and marshy terrain, and therefore, the search was ended without any indications of the teen's location. Lured fallen victim to more nefarious circumstances, the teen's now panicked family were grateful when two brothers, who lived nearby, took over the search. Out of the kindness of their own hearts, the brothers were well acquainted with the area and resumed searching at the urging of one of their own children, who was friends with Danielle's sister. After approximately 45 minutes of scouring the now dark area, one of the brothers was horrified to stumble upon Danny's lifeless body, laying face down in a shallow pool of water. An autopsy conducted on September 23, 1996. The medical examiner stated that they had found, quote, muddy material in the 5'5", 130-pound teenager's stomach. The same material was also observed in her upper and lower airways, indicating that the teen most likely put up a valiant fight and in doing so may have been shoved into the ground, subsequently inhaling the moisture below her. To the pain of the teen's family, also noted in the autopsy report was the observation of a recent laceration of her private parts, indicating a sexual assault. Her watch, gold with an elastic band, was pulled part way over her hand as if she had been dragged by that arm. The medical examiner noted that her clothing appeared to be improperly positioned, with her bra pulled above her breasts and her underwear with the left lateral lower edge rolled over the top, indicating that she may have been moved or dragged in a way that disturbed her undergarments. To no one's surprise, the autopsy report confirmed what her family and friends already knew, that the well-behaved and studious teen had no alcohol nor drugs in her system. Despite all of these findings, later, to the shock and reported disgust of many involved, a state medical examiner determined that Danny had drowned, classifying the manner of death not as a homicide, but as unknown. This classification complicated the investigation by shifting focus away from foul play, which potentially could lead to overlooked evidence or lack of investigation of suspects. The labeling of her death as unknown reduced the urgency and resources allocated to the case and created significant barriers in identifying a suspect. Eventually, with no leads or new developments, the case would grow cold. The sheriff's office decided to reinvigorate their investigation of the case in 2019. Initially, such an action was the reopening of old wounds, as Danny's family had felt a significant distrust towards law enforcement Due to the past classification and subsequent handling of the case, even former police officers who had worked the case expressed their deep frustration over the initial handling of the investigation, with some alleging a systematic lack of urgency to find a suspect. The previous Sheriff Slaughter, who was in charge at the time, defended the investigation, stating that the detective's pursuit is a homicide, despite some public proclamations suggesting otherwise. However, Danny's family members dispute that law enforcement ever communicated their intent to investigate the teen's death as a homicide. The slain victim's sister, Stephanie Moulet, who was only 12 at the time of the murder, recalls police's response in the aftermath of the crime, saying, quote, "What my parents took away from the law enforcement investigation was, well, it could have been just an accident." In 2021, after more than a quarter-century of uncertainty, Dan Springer, who had just become the Gallatin County Sheriff, made the wise and ultimately game-changing decision to bring in 2 outside experts from California to assist in the investigation of the team's death. Made the wise and ultimately game-changing decision to bring in 2 outside experts from California, hiring private investigator Tom Elfmont, a retired LAPD officer, and Sergeant Court Depwig, a forensic DNA specialist. Elfmont was sworn in as a special service deputy, and together the two took inventory of the evidence that was collected in 1996. In August of 2023, based on what the Sheriff's Department said was new findings, but those close to the case believe was more likely a re-examination of old findings. The manner of Danny's death was officially changed from undetermined to homicide. The two ultimately took possession of 4 rootless human hair strands that had been collected from Danny's body. At the crime scene, those strands were sent to Parabon Nanolabs in Virginia, who used them to create a partial DNA profile. That profile was then passed on to famed genetic genealogist C.C. Moore, a pioneer in the use of autosomal DNA. Moore is the chief genetic genealogist for Parabon Nanolabs, heading their genetic genealogy services for law enforcement, boasting an unparalleled record of over 200 successful identifications of violent criminals. In the 2 years since the unit's launch, Moore's method utilizes the DNA left by a suspect and matches it with DNA samples that have been voluntarily submitted by family members. This method allows law enforcement to build a more extensive family tree compared to simply using databases like CODIS alone. Ultimately, after extensive testing and confirmations, authorities were able to identify 55-year-old Paul Hutchinson as a potential suspect. On July 23, 2024, investigators Elfmont and Depwig interviewed the now 55-year-old who was living about 100 miles away in Montana but had been living in Bozeman at the time of Danny's death. Elfmont recalls Hutchinson, quote, "turned white when he and Depwig introduced themselves and stated their purpose for asking to speak with him face to face. The subsequent interview lasted for nearly 2 hours, during which Hutchinson displayed a high level of anxiety. Investigators carefully watched as Hutchinson became visibly agitated. His brow glistened with sweat. He repeatedly scratched his face, and in a particularly unsettling movement, began chewing on his hand. The tension in the room escalated when detectives presented him with a photograph of Danny. Hutchinson's response was immediate and revealing. He slumped back into his chair, seemingly overwhelmed, as his body language conveyed discomfort and unease. Hutchinson, previously unknown to law enforcement, was a longtime fisheries biologist for the Bureau of Land Management in Dillon. Such a job specializes in the conservation and management of fish populations in their habitats, conducting research, monitoring aquatic ecosystems, and implementing habitat restoration. An avid outdoorsman and family man, he had been married for 22 years and had 2 adult children. Hutchinson had been a student at Montana State University in Bozeman around the time of Danny's cinchless and seemingly ran to murder. Detectives believe the attack was spontaneous, stating that Hutchinson most likely encountered the 15-year-old by chance at the fishing access site, where she was believed to be alone. The sexual assault and subsequent slaying was most likely a, quote, "crime of opportunity by an evil man." The slight similarities and surnames aside, detectives could discern no connection, personal or professional, between the 15-year-old and Paul Hutchinson. though would have been in his late 20s at the time of the murder. Upon authorities notifying the victim's family of the newly discovered culprit's name, Danny's sister recalls her initial reaction was that of relief, that the killer wasn't a person known to Danny E. or her family, reflecting, she said, quote, "It wasn't someone where we'd not only have to deal with everything that goes along with solving your sister's homicide case, but also that feeling of betrayal. If it was her friend or a family friend or community member." To the shock of all involved, Houchinson took his own life just 10 hours after investigators interviewed him. In the pre-dawn hours of July 24, 2024, Houchinson had called the Beaverhead County Sheriff's Office, simply informing them that he needed assistance. Before hanging up, deputies who responded to the call for help found the 55-year-old on the side of the road. He was later pronounced deceased from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Days later, DNA collected from Houchinson posthumously would prove to match DNA evidence collected from Danny's body, providing what the sheriff's department described as, quote, 100% confirmation that Paul Houchinson was indeed the killer at the time of his suicide. Paul's family was unaware of his connection to the well-known local tragedy, who by all accounts kept his family in the dark about his own personal darkness. After nearly 3 decades, Danielle's family was able to place another piece into the puzzle of grief they continue to endure. Danny's sister released a statement to the press, ruminating on the bittersweet nature of the findings. After nearly 28 years without justice, we celebrate today. Even though this man will not face a jury of his peers, I have no doubt that he was the one who forcefully and violently sexually assaulted my sister, then held her head down in a marsh until she choked to death on mud. When the time came to face up and account for his violence, he instead chose to end his life. He knew of his guilt and couldn't face my family or his family and the pain that he had caused. Terri Ann McAdams was a vibrant 22-year-old woman living in Arlington, Texas. She was known for her beauty, energy, and zest for life from a young age. Terri was always popular as a teenager. She cruised around in a convertible, equipped with an 8-track music player, making her the go-to person for rides, and she often could be found driving around town with her friends or her sisters. After graduating from the University of Arkansas, where she'd met her fiancé, Terri moved to Arlington to be with him and to continue her education. She enrolled at the University of Texas in Arlington, eager to pursue her academic goals. But on Valentine's Day in February of 1985, tragedy struck Arlington. Police were called to an apartment at 2525 Walnut Hill Circle. This was Terri's fiancé's apartment, where Terri had been living for the past 2 months. Inside, her lifeless body had been discovered by maintenance workers in the corner of her bedroom. An autopsy revealed that she had been sexually assaulted and savagely beaten to death with a blunt object. It was determined that she was killed on either the night of February 13th or early in the morning on February 14th. Police did not find a murder weapon, but believed that the killer had used a hammer or some other type of blunt instrument. At the time, a filtered cigarette butt was found at the scene. Even though neither resident smoked, investigators found evidence that the murderer had broken into Terri's apartment through a sliding glass door. Police say her killer left a distinctive footprint right outside. Police tried to piece together Terri McAdams' movements prior to her death on February 13th. At around 4 p.m., she had left the University of Texas at Arlington and headed home to change clothes. She then made a few stops, including the Safeway grocery store on East Lamar. She had been planning to bake a cake for her fiancé. For Valentine's Day, she also went to Reno Cleaners. Records showed that Terri had been at Safeway around 6:30 p.m., according to a cash register tape police recovered. Investigators questioned people who had been at the store that evening, hoping someone might have seen something unusual, but nothing would be found. At the time of her death, Terri's fiancé was out of town on a business trip. He had planned to return later that day, and the couple were set to be married in just a few months. He was quickly ruled out as a suspect. It was discovered that Terri's $5,000 engagement ring was missing when her body had been found. Police suspected her killer had stolen the ring and therefore distributed 250 flyers to local pawn shops across the Fort Worth and Dallas areas, as well as to gold and silver exchanges. But the ring was never recovered. For nearly 40 years, Arlington police and Terri's family have asked thousands of questions, but received little answers. The case would eventually go cold. In 2021, Arlington police reopened the case, and physical evidence, which included a sexual assault kit, fingernail clippings, and the cigarette butt, were sent to a DNA lab for testing. Based on these decades-old but well-preserved artifacts, a profile for an unknown male was developed. The profile was interred in Dakotas, but never produced a match. In August of 2023, Arlington police reached out to the FBI Dallas field office to see if Terri's case would be eligible for the investigative genetic genealogy process, also known as EGG. EGG is a process that combines unidentified crime DNA genealogy research and the use of public history records to identify new leads for law enforcement. Genealogists were able to track down a distant relative, whose subsequent DNA sample proved that 30-year-old Bernard Sharp was Terri's killer. Please do not believe the two knew each other and say the attack appears to be random. Unfortunately, Sharp could not be charged, as he took his own life in a double murder-suicide. On November 3, 1985, Sharp fatally shot his estranged wife and her best friend, and critically wounded his wife's cousin in Arlington, Texas. The wounded cousin was able to run to a neighbor's house for help. Police said Sharp had forced his way into the home and waited to ambush the woman. He had been considered a possible suspect in Terri's killing and was even questioned, but there was not enough evidence to link him to the crime. Sharp had lived nearby and had multiple arrests and a criminal history of sexual insult involving two victims other than Terri. Authorities say that they will continue to investigate whether he may have been responsible for any other unsolved crimes, and his DNA profile has been passed on to both federal and state authorities. Police say because of his death, no charges will be filed, but expressed hope that the development will provide the family with closure. The case was considered solved after 39 years.